Hello and welcome to Book Circle. I'm Earl Wyenberg. This time we will continue our reading of Storm in the Village by Miss Reed. When we had washed up, Miss Jackson vanished across to the school to collect music and other odds and ends for the dancing display. Miss Clare and I sat in the garden resting before the fray. Of course, I said, turning back to Miss Clare's own problems, this housing estate will be bang next door to your cottage. Will it make much difference, do you think? I can't believe that it will ever happen, replied Miss Clare. And even if the plans go through, I imagine it will be some time before building actually begins. I doubt if I should live to see it. These last few words were uttered in such a matter-of-fact tone that at first I could hardly take in their importance. But surely, I said, shocked, you are stronger now. You look much better than when you were teaching. I sincerely hope that you'll flourish for at least another 30 years. It was my turn to be comforter now, but Miss Clare brushed aside my words with a shake of her white head that had never shed a shred of self-pity in it. I've had a good life, and a useful one too, I hope, and I've loved every minute of it, she continued soberly. But to tell you the truth, my dear, I'm getting tired now, and I shall be happy and ready to step aside whenever the time comes. I'd like to think of someone else teaching the children here, someone else picking my roses and sitting under the apple tree that I watched my father plant. I've had my party, said my party piece, and I shall be glad to give my thanks and go quietly home. St. Patrick's clock chimed 2:15. Miss Clare patted my knee and said briskly, "But the party's still on, you know. It's time we went across to the vicarage and took our place in the revels." We took the shortcut through the churchyard. Across the silent tombs and cypresses came the sound of a dance tune played through the loudspeaker. Hardly daring to look left and right, I hurried with Miss Clare toward the gaiety and safety of the flower show, as though ghosts were at my heels. As in very truth they were. In the vicarage garden, the scene was colorful and gay. Despite the overcast sky and the threatening line of black clouds which advanced from the southwest, the women and children were in their prettiest summer frocks and the men in open-necked shirts. Mrs. Finch Edwards, who had once taught with me at Fairacre School, was one of the most beautifully dressed women there, in a lilac creation of her own making, and her daughter Althea, now at the toddling stage, was in a froth of white frills. She was to present a bouquet to the opener of the flower show, who was a friend of Mrs. Bradley's and a famous gardener, and Mrs. Finch Edwards was having some difficulty in preventing her daughter from squatting down on the ground the better to eat worm casts. "Althea, please," implored the distracted mother, dusting down the dozen frills tossing around the child's hind parts. She had grown into a chubby, attractive child with dimpled arms and a mop of auburn curls like her mother's. The bouquet of roses was being secreted under a nearby stall guarded by Joseph Coggs, and Mrs. Finch Edwards hoped that Lady Sibylla would soon make a start on her speech, that the speech would be very, very brief, and that her daughter would do her credit and neither hurl the bouquet at her en route to the dais nor stop to pick it to pieces. "I'd rather do a fortnight's work at the shop," she confessed to me. "This is agony." But she looked very gratified, despite her agitation, at this honor done to her family. I inquired after the shop in Caxley, which she and Mrs. Moffat had recently opened, and was not surprised to hear that they had already enough orders for clothes to keep them occupied until the late autumn. At this moment, Lady Sibylla was led to the microphone and introduced. She was a large, vague, charming old lady, wearing a black cartwheel hat which gave her some trouble. One white-gloved hand rested upon its crown, and in the other she held her notes. A nasty little wind fluttered her silk draperies as she leant forward to speak into the microphone. "It is indeed a pleasure," she began in a sweet, light voice, when a mumble of thunder sounded overhead. There was a crackling from the microphone, and we heard no more. Quite unaware that 4/5 of her audience were unable to hear a word, Lady Sibylla continued with her speech, and the people of Fairacre watched this dumb show with docility. Mrs. Finch Edwards was terrified that she might not know when the speech was over, but all was well. With a charming smile and much nodding of the cartwheel hat to left and right, Lady Sibylla stepped back from her non-cooperative microphone, and Althea Finch Edwards was propelled forward, bearing the bouquet which was nearly as big as herself. She acquitted herself well, handed over the bouquet, and turned to rush back to Mother, but remembering in time that she should curtsy, turned back some yards away from the dais to make a wobbly bob. The crowd dispersed to the various stalls. The Bryant boys, dour-visaged and clad despite the warmth in Sunday black, made straight for the Bowling for the Pig, where they would stay for the remainder of the flower show. It was a foregone conclusion that either Amos, Malachi, Ezekiel, or Gideon Bryant would bear away the prize. Inside the giant marquee, the judges, among them Lady Sibylla, walked thoughtfully about with their notebooks in their hands and their brows furrowed. They pinched gooseberries, smelt roses, tasted jelly and cut cheeses, giving to every case that concentration of wisdom and experience which they knew was expected at Fairacre Flower Show. Many an anxious eye was cast upon them when at last they emerged, having left the tickets first, second, and third, which would cause such joy or despondency to the exhibitors. The rumbling of thunder became more ominous as the black cloud arched over Fairacre. It was decided to put forward the dancing display, which was to be held on the lawn, in case the rain came, and the vicar announced through the badly crackling microphone that Mrs. Kathy Waits would open the proceedings, followed by Miss Jackson's children. There was desultory clapping as Kathy came skipping from behind the vicar's laurel bushes, and one lone wolf whistle from a rude beech green boy. Kathy, her dark hair blowing in the breeze, was clad in the flimsiest of garments, as Mrs. Partridge had feared. Luckily, she appeared to be wearing her high school knickers of a commendable staunchness and a brief but adequate brassiere, but over these basic necessities floated a yard or two of green chiffon of the most diaphanous nature. In her hands, Kathy held a long strip of the same material, which she tossed from side to side as she bent and capered gracefully between the cedar trees and the produce stall. Occasionally, she fell onto one knee, cupping her ear as if listening to the horns of Elfland. In actual fact, the voice of one of the Bryant brothers, who had just missed 2 skittles while bowling for the pig, was deplorably audible, whilst Miss Waits remained wide-eyed and expectant in her listening attitude, and the words used must have given a more innocent nymph considerable revulsion. "That girl would do better with more clothes on her back," observed Mr. Willett to his neighbor in a carrying whisper. "Flaunting herself in next to nothing," boomed Mrs. Pringle from the door of the tea tent. "Catch me looking like that at her age." She wobbled her 3 chins aggressively, but remained to goggle at the scarf dance as it wound its airy way to its end. I hurried round the edge of the crowd to the shrubbery where Miss Jackson and the children awaited their entry. Roses of every hue, the children were in a fine twitter of excitement. "Why can't us wear our shoes? I've been and stood on a prickle. Can I be excused? I can't wait. I can't remember the words. I feel sick. My knicker elastic's busted." With such ominous phrases, well known to teachers in all school crises, the children greeted us. Miss Jackson, flushed and heated, was doing her best to calm her flock. "Would you remind Miss Clare that we'll have the first part twice?" she implored me, and I made my way to the drawing room where Miss Clare was visibly sitting at the piano by the open French windows. As I threaded through the edge of the crowd, I noticed a man with a woman and a little girl also approaching the French windows. Betty Franklin was arriving at her page-turning appointment with her father and her aunt from Caxley. We greeted each other, and I made inquiries about Betty's new school in Caxley. The aunt was a pleasant, fresh-faced person who chattered away about her little niece, but John Franklin stood slightly apart, eyeing the crowd and looking self-conscious. "You run along to Miss Clare now," said the aunt, pointing to the piano, and as the child stepped over the threshold, the woman turned to me as though she were about to speak, but stopped short. From among the crowd, a large young woman in a bright yellow beach frock which matched her brassy hair stepped purposefully toward John Franklin, who watched her approach with obvious amusement. "Fancy seeing you, Johnny," said the plump beauty, looking at him sidelong from under well-plastered lashes. She edged a little nearer. "What are you doing anyway in Fairacre?" he responded jocularly. "I got an auntie lives out this way at Tyler's Row. Mrs. Fowler, she is." I remembered suddenly that Mrs. Fowler had a niece who was the barmaid at The Bell in Caxley. This must be the girl. The two began to stroll slowly away toward the shrubbery where the Fairacre children still waited for Kathy to finish fluttering her draperies on the lawn. Betty was listening to Miss Clare's directions by the piano, and the aunt turned to me in some agitation. "John was a good husband to my sister, but there, he's like all of them, needs company. Sometimes I think—" But here her voice faltered to a stop. Her eyes were fixed on a little scene near the shrubbery, and my gaze followed hers. Hilary Jackson had come running out, presumably to give Miss Clare another last-minute direction, and had encountered John Franklin and his brazen companion face to face. She grew as red as a poppy and stopped short, her mouth open. John Franklin, with all the assurance in the world, inclined his head politely as he passed by her. "Got a nice crowd here today," he commented without pausing in his leisurely progress. Speechless, Hilary Jackson rushed past them and past Betty's aunt and me, stumbling toward Miss Clare. Her face was suffused and her eyes were full of tears. Once she was well inside, the aunt put an appealing hand on my arm and spoke in a low whisper. "He's a bad lot with women. If you don't tell her, Miss Reed, then I shall." After this unnerving incident, I watched the rose dance with even more detachment than usual. Miss Jackson was visibly upset, but luckily the children remembered their steps and the words perfectly, and encouraged by the applause of the onlookers, excelled themselves. As they made their way from the lawn, bobbing breathlessly along with a fine disregard of Miss Clare's accompaniment, a wicked tongue of lightning flickered across the black sky, followed by an ear-splitting crash of thunder. Within a minute, huge drops began to fall, the rain drumming down upon the baked lawn and bouncing dizzily from its surface like a myriad spinning silver coins. Covers were hastily thrown over the stalls, and the crowd ran for shelter either to the marquee or to the tea tent. I found myself wedged by the table bearing a score of entries for "annuals in a soup plate," and remembered that spring evening when I had humbly suggested this class. First prize, I noticed, had gone to Mrs. Willett, who had nasturtiums in a deep plate with green dragons on it. In the corner behind the vegetable stall, I caught a glimpse of John Franklin and his companion. They seemed quite engrossed in each other, and as I was contemplating the outcome of this affair, a voice spoke behind me. It belonged to Mr. Willett, and the innocent words, delivered in his slow country voice, seemed pregnant with meaning to me. "Been stewing a long time, this here storm," commented Mr. Willett. Chapter 11. Parish Council Affairs. The Fairacre Parish Council meeting was held in the village school. Mr. Roberts had seated himself on a long ancient desk which stood at the side of the room. His tall, burly frame was too big to cram itself into juvenile desks, but Mrs. Bradley, small, alert, and ready for battle, looked quite at home in the front desk usually occupied by Joseph Coggs. 2 members from Beech Green sat nearby, for although that village was larger than Fairacre, it came in the latter's parish. Mr. Annett had unashamedly rummaged in his desk, abstracted Ernest's arithmetic book, and was studying his work with a censorious eye. Beside him sat the Beech Green butcher's wife, a large florid lady looking as succulent as her husband's joints. Mr. Lamb, from Fairacre Post Office, who was clerk to the council, had set out his papers on the teacher's desk and was now roaming round the classroom looking at the children's pictures which decorated the walls. "Too much paint slopped on this one," he remarked to anyone who cared to listen. "Shockin' waste of material, and never had these dern great lumps of paper when I was here. Half a sheet of small white, just big enough for a sprig of privet, and then shake the lot in careful." At this point, the vicar bustled in, breathless and full of apologies, and took his seat as chairman. Mr. Lamb sank onto the chair beside him and applied himself to his papers. "Apologies for Colonel Wesley, laid up with lumbago, I'm sorry to say," began the vicar. At once, remedies were suggested by all present. "Nothing like old-fashioned brown paper ironed on," asserted Mr. Lamb. "Nothing but heat and rest will do any good," vowed Mrs. Bradley. "Plenty of exercise and forget about it," said Mr. Roberts at the same moment. He had never suffered an ache or pain in his life. The vicar raised his voice slightly. "And from Mrs. Pratt, who can't leave her poor old father. I fear he's at his most trying as the moon waxes." There were murmurs of sympathy. Mr. Annett, snuffing away at Ernest's arithmetic book, looked skeptical. "And now to the main business," said the vicar, opening out a very long typewritten document which had so many pages that even the stoutest heart among the parish councillors quailed a little as thoughts of supper grew sharper. "I'd better read this straight through. The letter attached is from the clerk of the Rural District Council, who says that he encloses the proposed plan for an estate to house workers at the atomic establishment, and he would be glad of our comments." "Unprintable," said Mrs. Bradley vehemently. "Please, please," begged the vicar, "let us keep an open mind until we have studied this document." "Poor Mr. Miller," sighed the butcher's wife. "He came into our shop last week, and he looked proper broken up." "We don't know officially that Mr. Miller is involved in any way," the vicar said patiently. No one appeared to hear him. "Talk about Russia," commented Mr. Roberts with a snort. "Taking first-class farmland and putting a pack of townies on it to ruin it," exclaimed Mr. Annett warmly, "and 5 times too many children swarming into my school." "And what's to happen to our own kiddies?" asked Mr. Lamb, thumping the desk to emphasize the point. The vicar thumped beside him, and the parish council looked with surprise and some disfavor at this display of officiousness on the part of their chairman. "Ladies and gentlemen, please," protested the vicar, his mild old face quite pink with effort. "You are all jumping to conclusions. I must beg you to listen to the proposals here set out, and we will discuss them, impartially, I hope, after we have heard them." The councillors settled themselves more comfortably in their cramped quarters and turned attentive faces to the vicar. He began to read in his beautiful, sonorous voice, and his audience listened intently. Outside, the swifts screamed past the Gothic windows, and now and again the lowing of Samson, Mr. Roberts' house cow, was heard. From the window-sill, the scent of honeysuckle wafted down from a fine bunch that had been stuffed by a child's hand into a Virol jar. The wall clock, whose measured tick had acted as a background to the vicar's monologue, stood at 10 to 8 when at last he put the papers down on the desk, removed his reading glasses, and gazed speculatively at his thoughtful companions. "Well?" he asked. Mr. Roberts shifted his long legs. "Can't say I took it all in," he confessed. "Nor me," admitted Mr. Lamb sadly. Mr. Annett caught his chairman's eye and spoke in his brisk, light schoolmaster's voice. "It seems to me that it all boils down to this. Perhaps you'll correct me if I'm wrong?" He turned to the vicar questioningly and received a gentle nod. "The Atomic Energy Authority proposes to purchase, compulsorily if necessary, and it looks as though it will be, a site between our 2 villages comprising about 150 acres. This will take in Miller's 100-acre field with about half the slope to the downs behind. Provision is made for a school, playing fields for the community, and a row of shops. In other words, this township would be a self-contained unit." "There is no church," put in the vicar. His tone held a mild rebuke. No church," agreed Mr. Annett. "But presumably there would be room for more people in Fairacre or our own church." The vicar nodded his agreement rather sadly. "Plenty of room," he admitted. "Yes, my dear fellow, plenty of room." "Water and sewage is also included, and these services would probably be extended to include Fairacre and Beech Green. As I see it, this means that although the Atomic Energy Authority pays a considerable part, our local authority will also have to pay, which means that our rates will go up again." "Impossible," said Mrs. Bradley. "There's not a soul will stand for it." "And anyway," pointed out Mr. Roberts, "who wants to pay for something he doesn't want?" "Exactly," said Mrs. Bradley vehemently, turning her back on the meeting and settling herself face to face with the farmer for a really downright argument. The vicar thumped the desk again. "Thank you, my dear Annette, for summing up so neatly. Now, ladies and gentlemen, your opinions, please." "Not a brick to be laid on Dan Crockford's landscape," snapped Mrs. Bradley. "I think poor Mr. Miller should keep what's his own," asserted the butcher's wife. "I'm not sure that the people themselves won't be a confounded nuisance," said Mr. Annett decidedly. "I can see them making trouble about shocking rural schools." "But they'll have their own," protested Mr. Roberts. "Not for years, if I know anything about school building," replied Mr. Annett feelingly. "And I'll have a procession of outraged urbanite parents inspecting my school's sanitary arrangements and telling me that my teaching methods are archaic." "I don't know that the water isn't attractive, though," said Mr. Roberts meditatively. "Getting water up to the sheep on those downs has always been a problem." "What's the matter with the dew pond?" demanded Mrs. Bradley. "One of Dan Crockford's best pictures was always the ancient dew pond." "My husband had it on his trade almanac one year," began the butcher's wife conversationally. "He said those sheep drinking were as fine a flock as South Downs as he'd ever seen, and would have ate beautifully." "Nothing to touch a good saddle of mutton," agreed Mr. Lamb. "With onion sauce," said Mr. Annett. The vicar, seeing his meeting getting out of hand again, coughed gently. "The business, my dear people. The planning committee asks for our observations. Can I have firm proposals, please?" Mr. Roberts suddenly stood up, partly because he was getting cramped, and partly because he felt that the time had come for a decision. His great figure dominated the room. "I propose we have an open village meeting here in Fairacre and tell the people just what we've heard tonight and get their reactions." "Stout man," ejaculated Mr. Annett. "I'll second that proposal." Mr. Lamb scribbled busily in his minute book. "Agreed?" asked the vicar. Everyone raised a hand. "The only thing to do," said Mrs. Bradley, gathering her belongings together fussily. "There's much too much at stake for just the parish council to dispose of. Let's make it soon." "Next Monday?" suggested the vicar. "No good for me," said Mr. Roberts. "Friday?" said someone. "Choir practice," said Mr. Annett. At last, after various village engagements had been sorted out, the following Thursday was chosen, and Mr. Lamb guaranteed that he would put up notices in Fairacre, and Mr. Annett offered to put up more in Beech Green and let his pupils copy a notice each to take home to parents as well. St. Patrick's clock chimed 8:30 as the members of the parish council emerged into the playground. From a nearby lime tree came the fragrance of 1,000 pale flowers hanging creamy and moth-like beneath the leaves. "Smells good," said Mr. Lamb, sniffing noisily, "but I'd sooner it was my supper." He spoke for all of them. And we will follow this drama of urban development, not to mention Miss Jackson's drama, next time.